Hello friends, welcome back to another round of reviews. Backlog is growing quickly, so we probably have a few more meetings out of the ordinary. So we have another one on Wednesday, but then I may have to move that because there's other conflicts people have. So we may actually find ourselves doing a different day. But point being is for the next 3 or 4 weeks, we will have 2 meetings a week in order to go through this backlog that keeps growing faster than we can actually review items. All right, so today I think I scheduled these 5 here, but see how far we get.
All right. Yeah, so this is, we talked about this a couple weeks ago when I wasn't here. But to refresh everyone, the general idea is that we want to have an attribute that is similar to a mod rec in that it can indicate to compilers that they don't support this feature without having to go through the API break that adding a mod rec is, and to allow this attribute to appear in places that mod recs can't appear. Like, for example, on type declarations. Ref structs, for example, we mark with obsolete today, even though because you can't put a mod rec on a type definition. And so if we had added this feature at the time, we could have marked it with compiler feature required and then put a ref struct string or whatever we wanted in there. And yeah, that's the general idea. And importantly, it won't protect us from the past, right? Like older versions of the compiler don't know, of any compiler, don't know what this attribute is. They can't properly block it off. So at least for the foreseeable future, we'll have to continue using both this attribute and an obsolete attribute to try and give us as much protection as we can. But in the future, the idea is that we'd be able to not do the obsolete attribute, which has problems. What if someone wanted to put an actual obsolete attribute on the thing that is that we're trying to obsolete? You can't put multiple. Yeah, so that's the general idea. And then I tried to make it as flexible as mod rec versus mod opt, which is why I included the optional language string. In thinking about it a bit more, I've decided that maybe the string isn't a language string isn't the correct approach. Maybe it should just be a Boolean flag or is required, similar to mod opt versus mod rec. You can encode whatever you want in the feature name, and then you can mark it optional, and you can communicate within your language. Yeah.
That would make a lot more sense to me. I think the bigger problem I have with the language is that it just seems odd to use that as the indication of optionality. It just seems more like a, planting a flag, like, Fred was here.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can see that. My initial thought was, oh, you know, a language can say that this only applies to this language. This flag only applies to this language. But then I decided, you know what? It can just be. It's simpler to just make it optional, just a Boolean flag, and then the line you can. It's a string, so you can encode whatever the heck info you want um, in the feature name, much like you can today with whatever type name you want to generate for a mod opt or mod rec.
Right, but those are, I mean, those make more sense to me because they're effectively the feature name, right? And then it's basically like
Right. No, that's
the
what I'm saying.
yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
I mean,
Is the
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask, the compiler currently prevents users from manually specifying certain attributes. Is that going to be the case with this one?
I expect
Or
so, yes.
okay. So a user would not be able to write C# code that happens to be IL compatible with some F# feature and then put the right attribute on it. That seems fine. I just wanted to make sure that is the case.
That's my intent. We can certainly look at requests around that, but yeah, my intent is that no, you will not be able to manually specify this attribute in any location.
Sounds good.
So one question I have is, this is the other thing that wasn't clear to me last time. I mean, I think we asked for this multiple times on our side as well, that we would like to get off of this obsolete crazy train. But then, how, like, what is the actual mechanics in order for us to stop using obsolete? Because I mean, you still have to somehow poison pill the older compilers.
Well, that's what I was mentioning, right? Is that at least for the moment, for required members, we're going to have to put both obsolete and this attribute because no older compiler knows about this attribute.
Right.
You know, it's not going to be a we can start using this and only this attribute tomorrow. It's going to be a in 5 years when we add something new, we can go, you know what? We're confident enough. We all the major compiler platforms at this point support this attribute, so we are confident to start using it alone. But we can never get to that point if we don't start.
Yeah, I
Right.
agree. So that makes sense to me. So basically, the idea is that once the older compilers that don't know the thing are so old that we basically give up on that. That's basically the mechanic.
Basically, yeah.
That makes sense. And then, yeah. So are you then set on using language, or would you be okay with bool is optional?
That's what I was saying earlier. Is that I think bool might make more sense.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah,
And
and then
presumably the default would be false, right?
well, that's actually an interesting question. Presumably, I think the default should be true. But that can we word the we could say we could name the Boolean is optional and then make the default false.
And if we wanted the opposite, it'd be is required with false, probably.
But I think the default should probably be this thing
Mod
is
rec.
required.
Yes. So basically, you're saying if you don't specify something else, if you just apply the attribute with the feature name, it should be required. I would agree. That would make the most sense.
So a good name is probably is optional, and then the default will be false. It is not optional.
Yep, that makes sense.
And then the other question that I had for the group is whether or not we wanted to add strings to the BCL for well-known feature names. To start with, this would probably just be ref structs and required members, but we could potentially add some from other languages or some from C# languages in the future. I'm not sure what the feeling is on encoding more C# features directly into the BCL.
Well, I mean, I mean, it's kind of the, if you look at mod recs, they're effectively types today. So, and they are effectively encoded in the BCL by just having the types floating around. So this would be the logical. So, I mean, I'd be okay with saying we have them as strings somewhere. We can do this one of two ways. We can either do what we are doing right now with this other feature, where we have this attribute that allows APIs to say the string they are taking is in a particular language, and then we just have effectively well-known constants on the attribute type itself. So we could literally add them here and say, there's a set of feature names that we just put here as public const strings. that would work. I'd be okay with that. I mean, it seems desirable to have a centralized list so that we can just document them. And then also, you know, see basically what strings we're using all of.
Yeah. I was going to say we have runtime feature today right next to this, which holds all the runtime features. So either having them as named constants under compiler feature required attribute, or just having a, corollary C# feature class, would seem, both of them wouldn't seem out of left field or anything.
Would we want it to be a C# feature or a compiler feature class? That kind of gets back to language, right? Where we were concerned about what does another language put there if they support this feature.
Yeah, I think I would just say, from my point of view, like it doesn't have to be a complete list, but it has to be just complete enough. So I would say if we just decide that we put the most common ones we use here, but then of course if COBOL comes along, they want to put their own string, they don't have to put it in the BCL. They have on their own attribute. And if at some point if we want to say, oh, this is a useful feature, we want to use it elsewhere, at that point we would also probably call it. But I think for us it would be useful to have a centralized list just so when we review additions to it, we just know which ones we already have, how they are named, and just make it easier.
I think the question was more, what if C# decided to use a feature name for records, and then F# also has records. Now, how do you disambiguate C# record from F# record? Because even though they're both records, they're not binary compatible.
Yeah,
and so we could just name it, like we could say C# record is the name for all of the C# ones or something, but then you're still encoding the language information there somewhere.
I mean, yes, I would generally prefer naming that is not indicative of the language, but tries to express the name of the concept. That might be difficult at times, but I think we can qualify whatever the F# philosophy around records is versus the C# philosophy. Which in C# seems to be around the way quality. For that.
I think that would just lead to more confusion overall, because the domain specific knowledge for F# is record, and the domain specific term for C# is also record, and they are very similar, but there's nuances in how they're emitted at the binary level. It's just like we've got value tuples and reference tuples, and they're functionally both tuples, but they're different in how they work, how they're respected, and even the F# ones can work slightly differently from how the C# ones do.
Yeah, I mean, you probably have to put in the name record somewhere, right? I would just think of this as you have a longer prefix. Instead of saying C# records, you would say something else back. Reference. But again, like I think, once we do them, we probably have to talk about it. It'll probably be useful to say, okay, what is the actual list of things where it's C#? And that's not possible, yeah, we can always put the language in. That also, it just wouldn't be my preference. Anything else? I think namespace seems fine. Pipe name seems public bool optional. Get init seems. Attribute targets all make sense. Allow multiple makes sense. Inherited faults make sense. Anybody have any other concerns?
The only other thing is if we do want to put a list somewhere, then the code that I want to write to omit will want to pull from that list, as opposed to just encoding a regular string, probably.
Say again.
Like if we want to have a compiler feature or a C# feature class that contains this list of strings, then the code that I will omit will want to reference that constant, not hard code the constant in the compiler, right?
You mean pull the value of the constant from
Exactly.
Okay.
From the BCL.
Yeah.
So you're saying we might want to consider as part of the approved API for public const strings required members
if we
equals.
want them, then we should probably, because let me put it this way, I'm not going to open another API proposal to put up a list of const strings. So if we want to do that, then we should consider it now. And if we don't think that's important, then I'm fine with that. But,
well, I think it would be important, but I mean, we would have to see a list, right? You have a list now already?
it's ref structs and required members. Those are the two. Those are the two that we use the obsolete attribute trick with today. So those are the two that we would want features for.
So maybe just add public const string required members equals name of required members and public const string ref structs equals name of ref structs, just like we do for runtime feature.
That's exactly what I was typing right.
Same with me.
I mean, what I like about it is that it gives us a place to document, right? And we say, okay, ref structs means these things, right? Required members means hard to do. Yeah. Any feedback on the naming?
Someone in chat called out that compiler feature required is optional equals true sounds weird. Should it just be compiler feature attribute?
I don't think so.
I mean, compiler feature does.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the only thing that we could do is like just turn it around. It requires compiler feature that might read compiler feature. But I don't know. Like,
what is the intent of a mod opt or this saying it's optional?
The intent is to increase what the original intent of mod ops was for allowing languages to communicate in between themselves. The reason for is optional is to create the same expressiveness in this feature as you have in mod opt versus mod rect.
it's basically
Have
what
we
you
ever
want to
used the
compile.
mod ops?
Yeah.
What was that?
Has a mod opt ever been used?
I have no idea. Not in C#, to my knowledge.
C++ CLI uses mod opt for many features.
That does not surprise me.
Yes. I don't think we should like limit the functionality here. We should just mirror what the BCL already exposes and not question our forebearers here, because it does get used in various contexts in various languages, even if not C#.
And also,
the BCL doesn't have any notion of a mod opt. That's entirely
Yes, it does. The BCL explicitly has mod opt and understands it as part of the type of the signature.
I'd say that's the CLR, not the BCL.
Sure, but I mean, what do you mean by the BCL? I mean, it's part of the type system, right? So I'm not sure what it means.
Like really, for me, it's the how has it been used, and like just saying a Boolean. If we knew how it was been used, and then maybe we could come up with a better way of describing it. Is what I was getting at.
I mean, it's basically a feature that is used by the compiler, right? So anything that we have done that was done using C++ CLI has probably emitted mod because they use them quite a bit. But most of the BCL is written in C#, and C# hasn't used mod ops that much. I think the only things I know of is volatile, but I think that might be a mod rec actually. When you declare a field as volatile, that's emitted as a modifier.
I don't know.
But I think this is the only thing I can think of right now. But to me, that's kind of the thing, right? So now we are talking about effectively adding mod rec and mod opt style things as attributes, because the problem with mod recs and mod ops are they can only use them in signatures. You can't put them on devs. And so this is effectively just moving that limitation, allowing you to use it on members or on type devs.
It's a mod rec, by the way. I just checked.
See, but memory serves. Modifier. I think the question is, I mean, do we want to do, I mean, the only thing we could consider doing, instead of using strings, we could decide to basically follow the mod recs mod style and just say they're all types, right? And then instead of saying you take a string feature name, you take a type. And then you could say, well, for the cases where we want to use those things on a definition, we use the attribute. If you want to use it inside of a signature, we use the other thing, right? But my gut feel is that probably it's always one or the other. There really isn't much of a, oh, sometimes you use it this way and sometimes you use it that way situation.
Yeah, my general view is you try to use a mod rec unless you cannot for multiple reasons. Either you can't, or for one of potentially multiple reasons, like you can't use it because it's a type tackle and you can't put mod ops there or mod recs there, or you're concerned about binary compatibility. And you actually don't want to break binary compatibility by adding or removing this thing, which is where we are for required members.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, to me, the optional thing makes sense, right? Because you effectively want to encode to the consumer, if you see this attribute applied, what do you want the compiler to do when they don't understand what that thing? And there really are only two ways. You either say you can't use the API or you can, right? That's basically what the optional is expressing. So in that sense, it is mirroring what mod ops and mod recs are doing. But yeah, I'm happy with the shape. I'm happy with the name.
I have no other concern.
But I think Jeremy wasn't happy.
I'm just trying to, that was the feedback from chat, and I agree it's a little weird if it says required is optional. So to me, that suggests either a parallel attribute of optional, or if somebody could explain to me the purpose of opt, then I could maybe come up with a better name, but it sounds like we can't because it's
the optional is literally, the purpose is, does the compiler prevent you from using this member if it doesn't understand it or not? That's
right.
That's the purpose.
What's the thing that the compiler does differently once it understands it versus that it does naively because it doesn't?
And
I guess that's
on the feature.
Up to the feature.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I can't answer that question.
Well, I mean, just look at the two examples that are on screen, right? Ref structs and required members, right? The behavior is drastically different, right? I mean, required members controls when you can, like, what should happen when you initialize a type, right? Should it warn when you haven't initialized the ones, or error out, I guess, when you don't initialize the ones that are also marked required, or not? And then ref structs is just, can you pass this thing freely around? Can you declare fields of this thing, right? Like, so there's no overlap at all, right? And any other feature would be in the same bucket, right?
Right, but would we say that required members is optional?
No, we would not. C# there.
Right.
To be clear, C# has no use for it, is optional at the moment, and
right.
adding it for expressiveness.
Yeah, and that's the thing that, in an ideal world, I would like to understand the kinds of things that get listed as opt and why they get listed as opt instead of rec, and then I could probably help come up with a better name, but we don't, and
you have to go look at C++ CLI.
We don't.
I think C++ example is const, for example. I think that, so when you declare something as const int, for example, I think in C++ it basically becomes an int that is modified with a const, because in C++ you can overload between a const int and an int signature, but then on the consumer side, you don't know what const means. It doesn't really matter because you pass an into it and then the thing just doesn't modify it and it's fine. So that's basically why C++ has this notion of optionality, where it's like, yeah, I took a const int here. So if you're C++ and you know what a const int is, then good for you. If you don't know what a const int is, then that's fine too, because you pass, just pass it in. There would be like examples like this. I think the reason why it might be more common in modifiers is because it allows you to overload them. Versus here it wouldn't, right? It would just mean FY, this thing is marked. So
I mean, could we do 2 attributes? Sure. It would just be more work.
Yeah, I'm just trying to address the concern from chat. I don't particularly care. So it doesn't sound like there's a great thing, so I'll go back on mute.
Does it make sense from an encoding size point of view?
Um,
Do we not care?
I don't think this is going to be very prevalent.
I guess it depends on where you emit it to, right? If you put it on every single member, might be.
It's going to be on the type declaration for ref structs and on any constructors of types with required members.
Yeah, I was thinking like, would we ever be in a situation where we would like to put it on everything that accepts a certain type, for example? At which point it might make a difference whether you have 2 attributes or whether you have 1 attribute. But the thing, in order to do that, I think underlying blob, I think, has to refer to the, to the token of the.
I mean, if every ref struct is painted with in order to use me, you have to know what a ref struct is, then all the members already transitively have that, because you already knew you didn't understand this type, so now you can't talk about this member that uses that type in the signature.
I don't think that's what would happen, right, Fred? I think if you declare a ref struct, you would just put the attribute on the ref struct definition, right? You wouldn't put the attribute on every single member that takes it or produces it.
I think that's what Jeremy was saying.
Yeah, but then from the compiler functionality, et cetera, perspective, if you're trying to call a member that uses that type, it's like, well, how'd you build one? This type basically didn't get imported because it used a thing I didn't understand. So I assume the compiler would treat it as a dead/unresolved symbol, and as long as you don't actually try and walk into it, you're fine.
Yeah, I mean, when we're importing stuff from metadata, or when we're referencing types from metadata, we will be checking for that attribute.
So it doesn't go on every member that used the ref struct. It goes on the ref struct, which effectively poisons every member that was on it, or every member that took it in a signature. But you don't have to literally spell it out in every usage.
Right. So basically, what you're saying is you. Yep, that works for me. I mean, I have to say I kind of don't like the idea of splitting the attribute because it means we have to have 3 types. But yeah, I think if we do split it into 2, we would have to have a 3rd type, because otherwise it's a bit weird to have the const on one of the 2. Would have to pick a home. And that seems a bit over-engineered. Nobody disagrees? And let's keep it as 1 attribute. You're moving. All right, then this is it. Given that this is an API that's only used by providers.
All right. Well,
alrighty, then this was that.
See y'all later, everyone.
Bye-bye, Fred. Does Tarek
activity.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is mine. So we have in system diagnostics activity class, we have a static property is called the current, and this property holds activity objects that reflect the current activity that it can be used in the current context. And so this property can be set either manually, I mean like users can assign the current activity manually, or it can be automatically assigned while you are starting any activity. So if you create activity and start it, it will be set automatically to the current property. And also when you stop the activity, any activity gets, I mean the current activity, if it is stopped, it will be automatically removed from the current, and we restore the previous current that it used to be there. So this is the purpose of current activities that we already have today. We got the scenario for the OpenTelemetry profiler that they need to track the change in the current activity. So they want to know about like when it gets changed. So they need to get some notification about that. And this proposal is about that. I mean, so it's just like adding the way that you can subscribe and get notification when the current activity is get changed. I have here the proposal, which is using event, but I have also other alternative proposals if we need to compare between them. I had also offline discussion with Jeremy Barton, and he mentioned to me about like if we are using event, so we have to use event handler. So if you look to the alternative proposal, the last one, I mean, not using event handler is just using action, just for simplicity. But if the requirement that if we are going to have event, and we should have event handler, so the proposal that I have here is the one that we will prefer. So basically, in activity class, we adding the event, and this event we call it like current changed, and this event have the event handler, and it takes the argument activity notification, which is it's a read-only struct, which is carry the previous current and the current. Yeah. So this is basically about the proposal.
I missed it if you said it, Tarek. How does someone use the knowledge of previous and current?
This is just for the profiler. I mean, this is for OpenTelemetry profiler. I mean, they just want to know about like if there is any change in the in the current. I mean, in the current context. So they need to know like what has been changed.
But they need, I understand you need to know the current. They need to know the previous because they do some sort of direct comparison between the two, and they don't have previous track themselves.
Yeah, I mean, like the most important is like it's about the current. I mean, this is more important for them, but previous is just like giving more information about what has been there and get changed. Yeah. To be honest, I mean, like I don't know exactly how the profiler is going to use the previous one.
Just make sure it'll actually be used, and then it's fine.
And presumably the struct has a constructor that takes both.
Yes, but it can be like internal because like it will be only us that creating this instance of this struct. Something.
I guess it could. I mean, the other reasons you could just make it init, I guess. It just seems weird to do this kind of thing because I mean, this is the kind of stuff where it might be easier if you just expose it because some people can write test methods. Otherwise, they have to write something in the middle that takes both of those, and not the kind of stuff where we gain much.
Yeah, I'm fine either way, either to have the constructor public or to have init for the properties there. I mean,
Right, then, or even making the properties settable.
Right, also that's a immutable structs are bad, but that's
Do we ever plan on adding members to this struct?
probably not for this notification at least.
I mean, would it ever make sense to use a record here? Or do we not do that in our APIs?
I mean, it's just syntax. It's not a different kind of type.
No, but it gives us a constructor and everything else, though.
We'd use a record if and only if we actually wanted everything that a record provides. If we want the toString implementation, the IEquatable implementation, the wither syntax, so on.
Okay, yeah, that I agree. That doesn't really make sense here.
Have we done init before? I think we have, right?
Yeah,
we did a few weeks ago.
We did it many times. We did it in system text.json, and we did it in system diagnostics before. I don't know what is the last week one, but
yeah, do we have
I think that was yours, Tarek.
Memory cache.
I mean, get init seems fine, and if there's ever another member added, that just makes it easier.
Why event handler of T?
Versus
Action of T, since sender is always going to be null.
okay, this is Jeremy can talk about.
So I can't defend it at all, but what we have in the guidelines is if you use the word event, you have to use event handler or something that looks exactly like it. That's just And I know that an event came up since the pandemic started while we were in this condition, and emo seemed to care, and that's pretty much what I told Tarek is if you use the word event, match the shape, and if you don't want to match the shape, don't use the word event.
I mean, it is a bit weird all up, right? Because I mean,
yeah, can you scroll a little bit down? I mean, so we can see the shape if we are not using
Yeah. So I can also say if we have two activities, it should not be action because you don't know which activity is which. So
I mean, an action of the struct, basically.
Yeah.
Because the other thing is, if for whatever reason you plan on adding members to the struct in the future, like you could also argue that maybe the struct should be taken as in rather than by val. Which means you need a custom delegate anyway, not event handler.
Except we say don't use in public API.
Sure.
Yeah, so this is two other alternative proposals. I mean, like the last one, which is not using event handler, is just using action. And this is actually the simplest form, which is, I guess.
The one before is a bit verbose, but I think I like having a type that basically encodes the arguments. I think that would make sense because then we can at least add an argument without, breaking our fingers. And then also action of activity and the com activity is also like, okay, which is previous, which is current, right? You kind of have to know. But I'm not sure that. Yeah, to me, the event handler argument goes a bit out the window, given that your thing is not even derived from event argument. It's just
right. Yeah, because we need to avoid the allocations. If we go with event args, we have to have a location at the time.
If we wanted to do the top alternative, you can make it a single method that just returns an idisposable, and you can call it unchanged or register for change or something much more concise. It doesn't have to be nearly as verbose as is currently there.
Yeah, and that pattern's used by ASP.NET in a few places as well. Like you register a callback and then you cancel it by disposing the return
cancellation token as well.
Yeah,
that's like our preferred way of registering callbacks in ASP.NET, but it does generally require an allocation for the idisposable.
I mean,
it does, but like this is static, right?
Yeah, like I just heard that mentioned earlier, so I'm
Well,
not sure how important that is.
Allocation was per invocation of the callback with the
My
event
bad.
arg.
Yeah, then yeah, it wouldn't matter at all.
So what is
Because
the
creating an event is going to create the multi-handle or multi-thingy delegate behind the scenes anyway. Like you can't have one without an allocation. But it's is it once or per call?
So what is the benefit of doing this thing over an event? I mean, isn't the overhead identical anyways? The event might even be more simple, right? Because it's just a chain list of delegates, which they all are anyway, right?
So what back in full framework, the reason that ASP.NET actually started using idisposable returns rather than events is because people would pass in lambdas into these add event handler routines, and it's very difficult to remove a callback when you've captured a local inside that lambda, because that's considered as part of the removal routine, which means that when the remove callback method is invoked, it would probably say like, oh, this is a different lambda capture than was originally passed in, so I'm actually going to no op, and you're still going to keep getting called. And idisposable was our way to avoid that.
Yeah, and this is before you could easily assign lambdas to a local without writing out like super long type names. But anyway, yeah, it's probably the main reason.
If you're passing a static callback, then this is a non-issue. If you're passing anything that's captured state, it's an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, I kind of use local functions most of the time now for these kind of things if I want something with capture. But what I have to.
Actually, that said, Tarek, how do you imagine people using this in practice? Do you imagine them passing a delegate which is a static or an instance method on a type, or do you imagine them passing lambdas?
It can be both, but it depends on like if they are willing to unregister later, so they will not use lambdas. But
right.
So it depends on the scenario they want to go with. But I mean, for the profiler, I don't think they are going to unregister at all.
Okay, so it would probably just be complicating the design for minimal payoff then.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd buy that argument.
We don't have any events yet on activity. This would be the first thing where we add an event. So now basically it would be the decision point whether we use events or whether we use a different pattern, right? Because the next time we do it, we would just follow what we do today, right?
Yeah, this is first time we adding event on activity. Yes, I mean, so I'm not sure about like if there will be any other scenarios that need to have such notification. I don't know. I mean, I'm not. It's unlikely. But...
I think the proposal at the top of the issue makes sense then. Like just keep the event handler of T and then have your custom T, which has your types being passed in it. It follows a pattern which is already established. We suspect people aren't going to want to unregister commonly.
And my only request would be to rename the struct to something event args.
Yeah, activity change event args. Even if it's not an event args, it at least looks like one.
Yeah, because I mean, I suspect if we add another event, like activity notification sounds too broad, and then we may end up with weird names. Like this one, very specific to this.
Yeah, but using event args name, does it confuse about users? They can think it's really inherited from the event args.
The T of event handler is called T args, so you're already passing it as a
yeah. Well, there's a comment in the source code that says that it used to be actually constrained to T extends event args, but that constraint was dropped in 4.5.
I remember that we spent like I think several days trying to figure out whether that's a breaking change or not, and nobody could figure out whether it was. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it wasn't. So like, I think I'm okay with that being a struct for practical reasons, right? But I would still probably keep the naming convention just to make it clear what it's supposed to be. Because I don't think anybody really, I mean, event args is an empty type, but there's not really any sort of information you would normally get that you don't get here. So I think in practice it will make no difference to people. It just makes the call
I'm fine.
sensible.
I'm fine as long as, like, as I said about, like, if it's okay, it's not confusing for users, I'm okay with it.
Jeremy, you had a suggestion for the name?
Well, I mean, it's activity changed event args makes sense to me.
Yeah.
This is the args you get when the activity changed.
Nice.
I guess the comment at the top doesn't anymore.
Is, I assume, Tarek, your nullability on the event is something that the compiler made you do, right?
Oh, it's intentional that I use this nullability.
I mean, you
So
don't
sorry.
have to, right?
Sorry. So
That's our default across all of our events because it doesn't matter for consumers of the event, and for implementers, that maps to the backing field, which can be null.
Okay, so the plus equal syntax doesn't care. I guess all that you can do with the thing is call plus equals and minus equals, right?
Right.
If you're outside of it. Okay. So I was gonna say anybody accessing the event object should never see a null thing, but if it's just an auto event, then yeah, the backing field.
I mean, is there any case in C# where declaring an event should be non-nullable? I mean, my understanding was that events you pretty much always declare nullable.
We have declared all of ours nullable. The only place we talked about where we haven't, where we would consider not, is if you if you were in control of your own backing field and you initialized it to always be non-null, so that you didn't have to worry about the invocation side of things checking. So you might initialize it to be a no-op delegate, and then it wouldn't ever be null.
So unless you specify add or remove bodies by hand, then
yes,
you always have to.
Right. Yeah. Again, I mean, whether it doesn't actually matter for consumers, so I don't even remember whether we put the question mark in the ref or not. But we have it in the implementation because it affects our own code invoking current changed.
All right, then. Oh.
You.
One down. Two down now. Oh yeah, I think this is Steven.
Yeah. So we talked about this one years ago. But since then, and we decided it was probably too niche and we wouldn't do it. But since then, we've hit upon a variety of cases where it actually is valuable. And so I think we should add something here. I don't have strong opinions as how much of this we add, but that we should add some. So the use cases are things like you've got some sort of large bit set, or some sort of bit set, and you want to see whether any of the bits have been set. Right, so you can call index not of 0, or you want to see whether they're all set. You can call index not of 0xff. If you're regex, we have uses for it because you have something like /s or space plus, and so you want to basically find the first thing that's not a space in order to find the end of the current sequence. You want to know you're working through something, filling something in, kind of like the bit set case, and you want to know where you left off, like the first place that hasn't been touched yet, so you can search for 0. And so there are a meaningful number of use cases here. I think I think Levi had previously commented that maybe we shouldn't vectorize these because maybe the sequences we're searching for would be too small on average to warrant it. I don't have strong opinions either way. We could choose to do just the overload that takes a single T being searched for and also a read-only span of T, or we could fill in the ones in the middle. But I think we do need index of, not of, and last index not of, so that, you know, that split. And then I also think we should be able to support any number of values, special casing 1. Beyond that, I don't have strong opinions.
For
so the one
vectorization,
you said we need is index not off and last index not off. So basically, you're not convinced that we need the any versions. Is that fair? Or did
No, sorry. I meant I think we need to be able to support both. I'm both directions of search. I wasn't ruling out the any.
I see.
I was saying I think we need to go left to right and right to left. And I also think we need to support, be able to search for one or more things. So, you know, we could just do the any overload, but searching for one is the common case. So my preference, I think, would be at a minimum, we have 4 overloads. Sorry, 8 overloads. With, you know, basically index versus last index, span versus read-only span, and T versus read-only span of T.
Sorry, Jeremy, I cut you off. What did you say?
If something here is able to be vectorized, is the single going to behave radically differently from a double, triple, or params?
It'll be the exactly as we have with index of today, except we flip a few equals and not equals in the implementation. We vectorize all of them, at least for index of. I don't remember if we vectorize last index of, for bytes, for single byte and, you know, double byte, like chars, up to 5 values. After 5, we fall off a cliff.
Yeah, we wouldn't even have to duplicate the code in index of helper. Like, we could literally reuse it with some ifs around it. We do the same thing in change case in system globalization. We literally abuse generics in order to reuse a single block of code to say you can do inclusive or you can do exclusive.
Fair enough. Just I can understand vectorized equality, which is that you've managed to make 4 zeros line up, and you can ask, is that a really big 0? But vectorized inequality was like, are there things for that, and how well is it going to work with multi?
We're not doing a check for is really big 0. It's still doing a per element comparison. And so if T is one of the primitive types, we just change from doing one comparison at a time to vector T count comparisons at a time.
Okay, so it loads in diffs, but then looks at the so it'll load, you know, 8 byte comparisons, and then but it looks at the individual elements instead of just big 0.
Right. We basically end up doing we do a compare not equal, which would give a vectorized mask, and we say if that is not 0, then something matched, and therefore we can then extract the most significant. We can do an extract mask, which gives you the per element mask value, and you can leading 0 count on it to get the index, and it's super efficient.
Okay, so I'm just, because vectorization was mentioned, I'm just making sure that if we look at this and say we could do it in the future and we want to add the thing, that we don't end up with a, you know, for complicated reasons, that the single one ends up running 8 times faster than the double one. And if you wanted the double one, really, you should just call the single one twice. I guess if that was the case, we would just implement it as calling the single one twice. But
so I don't have any objections to that. I mean, the only thing I would say is, like, you mentioned a bunch of stuff earlier about that we're not sure about whether it's worth it or not. But I would say if we add those APIs, it would be good if we had some use case somewhere, and then, you know, basically be able to measure it, whether, you know, a number of elements is worth it or not, and then take it from there. But I would not add it just because we see abstract value in.
Have we considered any alternative names here?
I was gonna say I don't like the not as an infix.
Yeah. Up earlier in the issue was the name index of any except, which I think is appropriate, because index of any implies that you are matching on multiple values, which you are. You're matching literally the entire range of values available to you, except for the things that happen to be passed in.
So for the vectorized APIs, we currently use op all and op any, and I think when we had discussed it last, we had suggested op none. But any except also makes sense, I think. Just as potential alternatives. I'm not super strong against not of, but it just reads weird to me.
Yeah. I think even of not feels better in my head, and I don't know why.
Index of not.
Yeah.
What's the index of not 5? Well, it turns out at 3 there was something that was not a 5.
This sounds
But I
like
mean, we already do have precedent for this, though. As I mentioned earlier and was earlier in the issue, like if you're matching multiple values, which we are here, it's index of any.
Sure, and that's why we have the index not of any.
No. I mean, every single overload would be called index of any, except because you are matching multiple values. It's just of the entire universe of values to be matched, you're explicitly passing in things that should not be included, but you're still matching on multiple values nonetheless, even when you pass in the one argument overload.
I see the difference.
You're saying, Levi, that basically, for chars, if I pass in, value 36, I'm basically saying index of anything either lower than 36 or higher than 36. So I'm searching for 65,000 minus 1.
Yeah, basically.
So it's index of any of those.
Correct.
Basically.
That's how I would interpret this.
I think that would make sense to me.
Yeah, I guess if you think just in terms of bytes, it's once you're searching for more than 127 of them, flip and search for not the remaining set. Fewer comparisons.
Yeah, I think now the overloads make a lot more sense to me. I think I like that naming.
Yeah. So
it was index of any except, that was the name.
And I can't take credit for that. That was, earlier in the issue. Someone had posted that.
Sounds fine to me.
And then
computers are finite search space.
And we go for 3 and then span.
So if we want to match what index of any does, we provide public implementation, public API for 2, 3, and any. 2, 3, and a span. Internally, the span one also special cases 4 and 5. For whatever reason, we didn't expose those. So we have a lot of flexibility here. We could just expose the span one, and internally it can still delegate to whatever it wants to specialize. Or if we think it's worth it, we could expose the 2 and the 3 one publicly. And if those are common, avoid the branching inside, and the creation of the span and whatever else.
Do we know where params span is? Was that C#11 or did that get pushed out again?
I think it's pushed out again.
Okay, then I'd probably just vote for consistency with the other APIs to do what we're already doing.
If I'm wrong, Tanner, would your vote then be to just have a param span?
Yeah, if we're already going to be shipping param span, then I think it'd be time to start just doing the other thing. And we have APIs now like isConstant, where we could basically get the same code gen and avoid the cost of the span creation for the the 2 and 3 element case.
Assuming, I guess that would assume we teach the JIT how to unravel what the C# compiler generates for a param span.
Yeah,
which for something
it
like
already
this, already
knows how to unwrap span constructors.
But for something like this, it would be if there was a unique special snowflake implementation for when there's exactly 2 of them, then having the method that's distinct from the params means that it can avoid the if I'm to go call the snowflake.
Right, and I was saying that the JIT internally now has an API that allows you to say, if this value is constant, then basically drop everything else as dead code and specialize.
But that would only matter if it inlined the call to.
Right, and you can the JIT has a heuristic that says if you've got that is known constant path, then bump the inlining heuristic.
Fair enough.
So we'd be able to set up the code such that you'd basically just have a small series of checks that says if the length is 2, 3, 4, or 5, then defer to the call passing in a constant, in which case it will inline and do the optimal thing, else go to the fallback path.
If we think we can make that work and work as efficiently, my inclination would be, regardless of whether params is going to be in C#11 or C#12, we only ship we only span one and save the, not ship immediate legacy.
There is definitely some nuance there, and it won't be as fast all of the time, and the inliner's still not perfect. Eventually it will be, hopefully, but there is still a little bit of nuance there.
What does index of any except target, comma, read only span of t.empty do? Just return 0 unless this target span was empty, in which case it's -1? Or throw why are you being dumb? Or
sorry, I didn't understand the question. What is the call?
So it is correct, Jeremy.
Some span dot is index of any empty.
It returns 0 or -1 if the span's empty.
Okay.
Because the dereferencing element 0 would in fact be an element that is index of anything except for the empty set.
Yeah, so it was just an argument validation question of, is 0 a throw, or is 0 a give 0 if it can and -1 if it can't?
So there's a big asterisk on what I just said, because double might be weird, and Tanner would know the answer to that better than I would.
Double is always weird.
And why would double be weird here?
And
if the first element in the span, if it's a span of doubles, that nan is maybe not equal to the empty set.
Yeah, there's potentially it depends on whether you're considering dot equals equality, and I think these index of APIs do dot equals, in which case nan equals nan, or whether you're doing op equality, in which case nan doesn't equal nan, and I don't think that applies given the where t is I equatable constraint. So I think it's probably fine and works like most people would expect it to work.
Full statement.
So Steve, you want to collapse this to
if we thought
just
that
one of each.
If we thought that it would be perfectly equal, then yes. But if there's reason to, if for the foreseeable future, regardless of param span, there will be benefits to having them separate, then I'd opt to just mirror what we do with index of and keep it simple.
I think the biggest thing is the JIT's still not perfect about this today. Igor Bogotov's still working on improving the inlining heuristics around the is constant helper. And then of course the ease of calling the API that takes two parameters versus taking a span.
Yeah, not needing, until we have param span, the annoyance of needing to wrap the thing in the go make me a single argument span or 2 argument span is, the syntax alone is probably cumbersome enough that the overloads are justified. So yeah, I think if we have uses for it, then I'm good as long as we move index not of to index of any except.
Yeah. A quick question here. Are we expecting to have this used with the chars a lot? I mean, like it will be a common scenario to use it with the chars or not?
Yes.
So if this is the case, so pacing will be interesting at that time.
So
it's
that's
operating on
kind of-
spans.
What's that?
That is kind of interesting. When we say chars, are we talking about like eating white space, or are we talking about eating actual letters?
I would, well, so the scenarios with which I plan to use it with chars, or maybe Jose plans to use it with chars, is in regex, where we are already considering, we don't consider surrogates, we don't consider multi-char sequences, it's one char at a time. So the answer for regex is both. If someone writes, A star or C star, will use index of any except A or index of any except C to find the end of that sequence.
So casing will be interesting at that time.
If someone specified ignore case, then we would in the construction of regex, we will map A to capital. We'll see that based on our folding tables, we end up with capital A and lowercase a, and so we would do index of any except uppercase a, lowercase a.
Yeah, it's very similar to the optimization that Igor actually just checked in a few days ago that you and I were talking about offline, Tarek. Or string dot index of, I believe.
Yeah.
So I think the overloads here would still work. The thing about casing is, if that normally implies that we would take a string comparison as a parameter, which means that we would have to figure out how to do like culture aware casing on a char by char basis, which is just weird.
regex is already doing that.
Taking the culture info, we have our own internal casing table, and that's what we would be using. So like in our case, the values that we pass in as a read-only span of like the possible values would be grabbed from our casing table. So like in our case, we wouldn't want to pass in a culture info. We already calculated that.
We also are, I mean, this isn't new to index of any except. This is the exact same thing with index of.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's exact for char only, but not, I mean, like if somebody wants to support this with the surrogate.
Sorry, what I meant was, and I hear what you're asking, but what I meant was this index of any except is not introducing any new ambiguity. All of those things already exist for any t. Like there's already index of any with some number of t's, which can be char and may not be char. So that's not unique to this API.
You could also imagine, Tarek, if in the future we wanted, say, a UTF-8 equivalent of this, we could have an overload that takes, I don't know, like runes or something as a parameter, and that would know how to handle surrogates correctly in UTF-16, and it would know how to handle multi-byte sequences correctly in UTF-8. But it would have to be a separate overload, though.
And we do with index of, we also have an overload, I believe, that's not generic, and that takes a read-only span of char and a span of char and a string comparison. I don't know what that would mean in an index of except. But we have explicitly added that overload separate from the generic ones in the index of case.
I mean, maybe I'm dumb, but like, how do we generally like? I mean, we calling equatable.equal in a vectorized fashion? We're not, right? We're just comparing the bits, right?
There is a check inside the method that basically says is bitwise equatable, and that handles things like int, char, and so on. And that says like if we can treat this basically as opaque bytes or opaque ints or whatever, then we'll vectorize it because we know how to do equality checking against raw bits.
Basically, the only thing we can vectorize is effectively when we can just compare the memory.
Primitives, yeah. But that's the case already today, so this wouldn't be new behavior.
Right. But it also would mean the value would go down, right? If we add it pair, right?
Correct. We would have to special case like equality compare of t.default, for instance, or null or something like that. Yeah, if you passed in an equality comparer that we simply didn't know about, then we would have to just fall back to doing a simple loop, which is fine, right? I mean, we have APIs that do that because we want to save people from having to write that code themselves.
Yeah, but I thought the idea of this is that it just makes it. And this thing doesn't really give you anything you can't already do.
I think there's two benefits here. One is it saves you from having to perform the operation yourself and manually code it. And so it saves you, having to write the loop and do the checks and whatnot. And then we can make it go really fast. I think if you take away one of them, it's still worthwhile doing, but it's certainly more worthwhile if we can make it go really fast.
Yeah, and that's a tweak we'd have to make.
From the sounds of it, you're saying like for regex we could, because we're effectively not going via the comparer because we know.
Yeah, even if this wasn't vectorized, I would still want to use it in regex because, especially in the source generator, it'll save us from having to omit all of those loops. Yep. Instead, we'll just omit a call to the function. If it's then vectorized, all the better.
Makes sense.
And that also means users' regex code will automatically get improved if we decide to improve the perf later, rather than needing to go and regenerate and recompile.
Oh, how many elements do we special case right now in our internal implementation?
We special case up to 5 of it for index of.
Okay.
I don't know how that number was chosen. I think it was chosen based on, I think we initially had 3, and then there were some file system cases that required like 4 or 5 or something, and so we added those in as well. I don't remember exactly.
Okay.
Depending on the exact algorithm, you could theoretically see improvements for up to 8, but probably not beyond 8. But of course, once you get that far, it's increasingly rare to hit those APIs. So I'd expect no more than 4 normally.
Also, earlier in this release, specifically for chars, I merged. We had like different implementations and different optimizations for string versus read-only span of char, and I merged them together. And in doing so, brought over one of the optimizations that string had that we didn't in memory extensions index of, which was for string, it quickly builds up basically a Bloom filter, and then for more than 5 values. And then uses that Bloom filter to quickly rule out characters that aren't, and then it will do the loop through all the values to check each one. So we could use a similar thing here if we wanted.
Oh, cool. Yeah, but that's something that we could do as an implementation without changing the API surface, right?
Right.
Perfect. Yeah, so I think then we would just have to take a look at how people are using this and tweak the internal implementation based on that, because like if you're trying to eat white space inside of a text file that represents source code, because there are lots of spaces representing tabs, that would benefit from vectorization. If you're just trying to eat random string.trim stuff, probably wouldn't benefit. So I imagine there will be some tweaking involved.
Sure, yeah. I mean, my ideal, based on your suggestion for one of the many generic tricks that we use to share code, would be that our starting point is we basically share everything that index of is doing and only add additional code to hook up the public API.
Yeah, exactly. It's just I think the use cases for index of and index of any accept will be different, unfortunately.
I think you're probably right. What I don't know is how much it will matter in practice.
That's fair.
Cool. So I guess then leave it at 3 for now, and then we can start it up later.
Sold.
Good. Next one, ConditionalWeakTable. I think this is also Steve.
Yeah, this should be really fast. So dictionary and concurrent dictionary expose an add method, but they also expose a try add method, because the add method semantics are to throw if the key already exists. And so they expose a try add as well to avoid the exception in the case where you're adding something that is already there, and it saves you from having, in the dictionary case, it saves you from having to do, the second lookup with a try get value. And the concurrent dictionary case, for atomicity reasons, you really can't do that because someone could have added it in the interim. So there, concurrent dictionary also had these helpers that tried to represent these combination operations, which you can implement with a little bit more code on top of a triad. ConditionalWeakTable, which is also effectively a concurrent dictionary, except one that uses weak references to the keys, and special references between the key and the value, doesn't have a triad. And so there are a variety of places in our own implementation where we have add surrounded by a try catch in order to eat the exception if there is a duplicate. And it's much better to just call try add. And this is proposing just adding that. It's already in our implementation. In fact, it's already public in our implementation because it's used by some of the libraries that have direct access to corelib. This is literally adding it to the ref.
Any reason we wouldn't also add try remove?
Doesn't it remove return a bool already?
I thought it did.
I think the try remove we normally have takes both key and value.
Yeah, because it removes the tuple itself.
We could, the remove that's already there, as was stated, returns true or false based. It really is a try remove. We don't have one that removes only if the value matches. I also don't have a scenario for that, but I'm not against it. I just don't know where it would be used.
Yeah,
I mean,
generally the way
I suggested it is because, I mean, as you said, like if we really want to treat ConditionalWeakTable effectively as a concurrent dictionary, then that's one that I think that is missing.
I don't think we want to treat it as a dictionary though, because it can drop values randomly without you calling remove. So I don't think we want to give it the same guarantees that iDictionary has.
It's not iDictionary, right? I don't even think the concurrent dictionary implements it.
Because if you had iDictionary, the way that you would implement try remove is that you would call remove of key value pair t key t value. It's just on that interface. But yeah, like iDictionary also implies it implies that you can get like the list of values as a fixed array, stuff like that. Which I guess you could do here by calling the enumerator and then calling to array, but
at that point you know what you're doing.
Yeah. But like if you call dot values on iDictionary, like do we have to give you back like strong references to everything? Do we have to keep it around like in perpetuity? Like it gets weird quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting that we literally make it implement those interfaces, but I was just saying, like, logically, if we want to align the types, if we want to align the operations, I guess, then that's the only obvious operation.
I would stick with triad for now, and if we find a use case for what you're suggesting, we go ahead and add that one too.
Else?
That was fast.
Type we all like, right?
Useful type.
You ready for the next one?
Yeah. I agree with this
So,
one, by the way.
So we have BinaryData that we added a couple releases ago, I think. And then last release, we made source generation for JSON a thing. And since BinaryData basically kind of wraps JSON serialization, the proposal here is to add overloads that take in the source generation information. So you can, when it serializes, it uses the source generator instead of the normal JSON serializer. And so it's basically just mimicking the APIs we have today that take in a JSON serializer options, and instead of the JSON serializer options, well, in the bottom two, it takes JSON type info, and then in the top one, since you're taking object and a type, you need to, we don't have a JSON type info that's non-generic. There's only JSON type info of T, and so you take the JSON serializer context, which has a method for this type, return the JSON type info. I think it's called get type info or something. Basically, like for system net HTTP JSON, we have this same we have the same pattern as well, where we have the object and a type, and take a JSON serializer options, and in the JSON source generation, we take the JSON serializer context.
I mean, it makes sense to me. I mean, there shouldn't be any downside, right? Because BinaryData already depends on system.text.json. Presumably, the JSON serializer context is defined in the same assembly as the rest of the JSON stack, right? And with JSON type info. Right?
You mean the base types? Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So basically, what I'm saying is system binary wouldn't have to depend on any new packages. It would just keep depending on system.text.json, and everything that you have here comes.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's just new APIs, but you're able to use BinaryData with JSON source gen, basically.
Okay, we just have to bump the version of the package.
Do that anyway.
Seems reasonable to me. I'm not convinced that BinaryData depending on JSON will not eventually bite us, but we crossed that already, so.
Agreed. Yeah,
that is
already there.
So, any concerns with this? I mean, the shape as you have it makes sense to me. It's just the translation of what the shape is. Do we normally call the parameters JSON type info?
Yeah, I think that's what I need to double check, but I'm pretty sure that's what the system text HTTP JSON stuff does.
Curious, what happens if you call to object from JSON of T and don't pass anything? Like it would bind to the overload that takes JSON serializer options and then pass a null. Like would it actually break in people's applications or prevent trimming or something like that?
Say it again. The top one?
Yeah, so you have an existing to object from JSON of T method, and if you call it, quote, parameterless, then it'll pass a null for that, correct? It'll bind to that method.
It'll bind to the top one.
Yeah, it'll bind to the top one. And I'm wondering, like, the reason we're adding these new methods is to make everything trimmer friendly, correct?
I mean, that's a reason, but there's other reasons for source gen as well. Like you get faster startup. You don't have to recommit code at runtime. Native AOT. Well,
yeah. What I'm curious about is, like, are people realistically ever going to call those last three overloads, considering if they just leave off the parameters, they'll bind to the first three? Like who's actually going to call those last three overloads?
Yep, people are concerned with trimming native AOT, potentially like real performance issues.
How are people going to know that they need to call those overloads instead of the first three?
So those existing APIs are all marked as requires unreferenced code, and these guys won't be. And so if you're gonna be publishing trimming or publishing for native AOT, you'll get warnings for all your calls to the top ones that say, hey, you should call this other one that takes the JSON type in.
Okay, so there will be some kind of feedback saying you're calling overload A, you should be calling overload B instead, and here's how you can do it.
Yeah, only when you turn on like trimming or native AOT do you get those warnings.
Okay, but the experience is there nonetheless.
Right, when you
cool.
care about, when you or one of your callers can care about trimming, you'll get warnings from your call sites to the top ones.
Okay, awesome.
But the top ones aren't annotated yet. And presumably by us exposing these overloads, you would also add the whatever the attribute is to be put.
Yeah, I can't remember if we. Oh yeah, no, they're attributed already. Requires
Okay.
unreferenced code. I'm pretty sure when I was attributing those, that's why I was like, oh, we should make JSON type in, or we should make JSON source generator overloads for these.
Yeah, the current shape seems unfortunate because you get warnings, but there's nothing you can do. So we should add these APIs. You can at least call something else.
Yeah, that's kind of how JSON serializer is as well, right? When you call it without passing in an options, you're going to get the one that's going to generate ref emit code.
Right.
And for a lot of our customers, that's fine, right? It works just fine. But yeah, once you want to go to native AOT or trimming.
All right, so I didn't hear anybody pushing back on this. Proof then? Easy. Any context on this?
This one sounds like a big one.
Agreed. Yeah, it's talking about polymorphic.
Yeah, we should set up a meeting maybe a little earlier in the day to discuss this, since Eric's several hours ahead of us.
One I think I diligently talked to too, because I had the same problem recently. Basically, how would you get an assembly name out of a metadata reader? Because you don't. You have to read the file. Or main constructed.
Seems useful. Generally, we call these parameters, path or file name or something like that. But yeah. If we did approve this, I would recommend calling that assembly path, I think, for the parameter name.
Yeah, it looks like assembly name, get assembly name, calls it assembly file already. I'm assuming that's where he copied it from. But I kind of agree that path makes more sense.
Is metadata reader different for consistency reasons at all? If I remember correctly, it was originally written by the Roslyn team or Roslyn, so.
That is a good question.
I mean, the data is already there, right? Really. So I think that this is just exposing something that, you can already do. It's just.
Interestingly enough, they don't have any APIs that take a string as a parameter.
Yeah, generally it looks like it's taking an assembly file handle.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the most part, I think the original, when they wrote the reader originally, I think they were targeting some version of portable that didn't include path API. It was when we basically tried to layer the whole thing in a way where path was higher level than. I think that was why a lot of these APIs don't take. And of course, most of them are handle based because they're assuming you already stand on the metadata form. And you usually start with the PE file. The other reason, basically, start with the PE file, which is in this other namespace, right? System reflection metadata ECMAR 335, and then from there you basically get the metadata reader. Don't construct the metadata reader straight out of a file path, which is fine because the API is not designed for usability, but wouldn't be my preferred way of doing it. That's pretty much everybody starts with.
Yeah, it looks like you've got assembly file handle and you've got assembly file, and they call that string name. So it's assembly file.name, which is the file name with extension. So maybe assembly file name is the closest to appropriate, if not just path, like Levi was suggesting.
Remind me, do these APIs take HTTP URLs as well? Or did we nix that?
No, I don't think they. I mean, they literally just open the file stream, I think, file directly.
Okay.
Oh, crazy. I mean, who opens an assembly from?
People who have assemblies with modules that are somewhere randomly on the internet.
Yeah, who is that? Outside of
click
once
ask Mary and Tanya.
Yeah, but I mean, outside of click once and the original craziness that we developed in .NET V1 days, nobody does that really.
Network shares, maybe.
I mean, file stream should work with network shares, I think.
Yeah, I mean, anything is a UNC path is fine. But who does HTTP blah? Yeah, I mean, it seems fine to me. I mean, we can CC them on it, but given the smallness of the API and given that the data is pretty much there, it seems like a reason.
Okay.
The only thing that we could consider is not putting on the metadata reader, but putting it on the PE file reader. But I guess that depends on your definition of what's a PE file versus what's a metadata file. But logically, the thing only makes sense on the metadata format, so.
Yeah, and it's a good question, but I would probably defer to the area owners to figure out which one of the two it should go on.
I agree. Who marked it as ready for review? Just forever and ready for review?
No, Vlad added it halfway down there. Right there, near the top.
Yeah. This was this year. Who is the area owner for this? Is it Booyah?
Yeah, it looks like it's Booyah, Jose, and Steve.
Jose is still on the call?
I am on the call, but I'm not very familiar with it. Like usually all these ones are handled either by Booyah or Steve. All the reflection related ones.
Maybe we want to come back to this.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'd be okay with just approving it unless.
Yeah, I think we can tentatively approve and just ping Booyah and Steve offline and just say hey, everything look good to you?
Yeah, this may also be one of those APIs. I think this is one of the API surfaces where it's owned by our team, but it's likely not driven by our team. I'm pretty sure every change to system reflection metadata has been driven by Rosalind so far.
Yep, I believe that's right.
The only changes you made is
So weird question. Are there any APIs that return assembly name today from metadata reader?
I don't believe so.
I don't believe so. I think they all return handles, and you're expected to convert the handle to the appropriate type if you need it to be resolved.
Does this introduce a new assembly dependency? I guess assembly name's in correlate, isn't it?
That's in correlate,
Okay,
so
never
you
mind.
can always. Isn't all of reflection now in layer that you couldn't, right? The thing that.
Yeah, I was confused because reading the description, it sounded like this was part of like rewriting assembly name to call this as an implementation detail. I'm like, wait a minute. Like how do you have some cross reference here?
I mean, the only reason why you would want an assembly name is presumably because eventually you want to call loader APIs with.
I mean, or just otherwise inspect it, but yeah.
Right, but if you just want to inspect it, then you could just use the existing assembly data that the reader gives you, right? Because the reader gives you this, oh god, I think it's assembly, either assembly definition or assembly reference. And they basically already have culture, flags, hash value, name, public key token, and origin on it, right? So you can already do that. It's just that the reason why, and so I mean, you can implement this method yourself by just writing the 20 lines of code that is basically starting with get the P file, get the metadata blob, do the validation, ask for the manifest, and then extract the values. So you can do it. It's just, if the only thing you want is an assembly name, it's not great. And then the assembly name API itself has a parse me from a path, but that goes through the loader, right? So you can only inspect things that the loader is able to load, which isn't great. So that's why I think it makes sense to have the API on the metadata read. But yeah, all right. I guess we approve unless somebody decides otherwise. Even are you still with us?
I am. This one probably won't be short because I think Levi had some concerns. We should probably flip it back to not ready for review.
Well, to be honest, like my concerns, I think, can be addressed through documentation. So if you want to march forward with it, please feel free.
Oh, okay. Well, let's discuss it then.
Right. API shape here.
Yeah. So the idea, and we could come up with a better name or whatever, is you've got a sequence of things, and you want to know how many of them at the beginning of each sequence is the same. So if one sequence was A, B, C, D, E, and the other was A, B, G, H, I, J, K, you get back 2 because A and B is the same at the beginning of both. So you're looking for how long is the common prefix at the beginning of both things. And it could be 0 if there was nothing shared. It could be 1 if there was one thing that was the same, 2, and so on. Yeah.
This needed for regex also, or
if you scroll up to the top, a little bit further up, you can see I found at least 3 places we're using it right now. One of them is in JSON Reader, one of them is in regex, and one of them is in path. I know Levi had some concerns about the correctness of the path one, but nevertheless, these 3 all implement that thing.
I assume that no match returns -1.
Returns 0.
Oh, right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was thinking.
Yeah, the difference between index of versus length.
Length, not index. So.
Yeah.
Presumably, the idea would be that we are able to vectorize it, or
it's more. I mean, if we could, great, but it's just more of a common pattern. And it's not a ton of code. So I found 3 places we could use it. there are probably a few more. If we decide, it's not worth it, then fine. But it does seem like it's a pattern that shows up in a variety of places and it just gets re-implemented.
I'm pretty sure I've implemented this myself. I just can't remember in which circumstances, but I think it had to do with something with path. I wanted to find the common ancestor.
I think we have a separate API for path, if I remember right.
Yeah,
it does, but it would use this under the covers as an implementation.
Does the one for path not take into account relative differences?
If you scroll up for a second, just a few clicks, I think that there's one in path there. I don't know if it's the same one that's being talked about.
Okay.
I want to say that the reason why I did it is because I implemented effectively make relative path before we had the API. That's when I did, I believe. Could be wrong.
Yeah. So what the JSON and path call sites do is they find the common prefix length, and then they keep backing up until they find something that they can actually report back to their caller as like, here is the thing, the sub expression that's actually like A.B that was common between the two. Actually, I think in the JSON case, they simply report the bytes as here's where I saw a byte that I wasn't expecting. In the JSON case, this is only used for error reporting, I believe.
I mean, I've also done it for display purposes. You have a bunch of files, you want to basically have something that is shorter. So you basically find the common prefix and print everything that comes after that only. The path on display. I think it's a useful API.
It is, yeah. When you're printing it for display, you definitely want to make sure that you're stopping at a proper separator, like a slash or a dot or something that's known to your application, which you would presumably do if you're printing out file paths.
Yeah. Well, or you just say screw displaying stuff. So
yeah, so you have so cat.txt and clothing.txt, like yeah.
Pretty enough. So somebody's saying common suffix length. I mean, I don't think I've ever needed that, but if somebody needs it, I mean, it seems reasonable. Effectively the same code, except for loop is reversed.
Yeah. Maybe a different API proposal. If people think that it's worthwhile.
Yeah, I would say like somebody would have to come up with a scenario. As I said, like I think I've never had that need, so I would be. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It just seems a lot more fringe than.
So regarding the APIs, Steve, if we have equality compare equals null as a defaulted parameter, would we still have the two member overload?
Oh, that was silly on my part. I think no. I think we would either just have one overload that took an optional compare, or we would not have it default to null.
Okay.
I don't have a strong preference.
I don't either.
For type of char again, about like does the casing would be interesting here still, because like it's a prefix. Like the file passes that
I think this. I mean, this is sort of related to some of the concerns that Levi was expressing in the thread, which not specific to casing, but if you were focused on char, do we need to be focusing on linguistic comparisons and things like that?
Yeah, it's not just that, but also surrogate handling and things like that, which both path and regex explicitly disavow. That said, like you can't pass string comparer in for that parameter because string comparer is I-equality comparer of string, not I-equality comparer of char. So at least people would not be able to build an incorrect call site.
Interesting. So how do we solve this generally with our string-like ban extension methods?
if you want to do a common prefix on strings while taking case conversion into account.
Well, like all the other operations we have, right? We have trim, start, trim, and all the other ones, basically string-like operations over a span. Don't they take an I-quality compare?
I think they just take chars as the set of characters that you want to trim.
Yeah, I think we provide non-generic overloads, and then we provide string-specific parameters on those where relevant.
Do they take a string comparison then, or like are we just saying we don't care about? We just say the only thing we support is ordinal.
I would say that just do ordinal, just like we're doing with index of any accept. Because if we wanted to do a string one that takes, say, a string comparison, like again, first off, linguistic is going to be, oh man, such a pain to implement because it's code that we've never had to write before. Second off, we probably want to have a UTF-8 enlightened one as well, which means we would need an overload anyway because read-only span of byte's not going to cut it. Sorry, the existing read-only span of byte overload wouldn't cut it.
Only with UTF-8 string, huh?
Just to make sure I'm on the same page, Levi, it wouldn't cut it because it wouldn't know how to. It wouldn't know that it was UTF-8.
It wouldn't know that it was UTF-8, but also the common prefix length. If you want case sensitivity, or if you want a case insensitive comparer, the common prefix length could actually be different in the input strings.
Right.
And just to answer your earlier question, Emo, like in the few places where memory extensions exposes string-like things, like index of, just the plain index of that takes two spans, the one to search, the one to the haystack and the needle. We expose T-based overloads, which are just ordinal, and then we expose like read-only span of char, read-only span of char, string comparison.
So we'll do the same here if we cared enough.
Yeah, if it ever presents as a need, but I'm with Levi. I don't want to implement that.
No, I'm just saying. I'm just asking like what we have done in the past to address that.
Yeah.
It sounds like that's what we have done. And presumably we don't have something for UTF-8 either today. We only have T that is ordinal, and then we have UTF-16, which is char, right?
Correct.
And if we wanted a UTF-8 enlightened one again, it would have to be a separate overload anyway, because it would actually need distinct behavior from the overload that we're introducing here.
Yep.
Which I think is totally fine.
So then I would say it seems fine as proposed. Grow it. Scared.
Do you need an I-equatable generic constraint?
I don't think we generally do that. I think one you can pass in the.
Well, the difference is if it's a simple comparer, the data is able to inline in the case where it's generic versus not inline otherwise. But we definitely don't do that commonly.
I thought the problem was always if we add the constraint, then you wouldn't be able to use it from. That's because.
Yeah, which is another problem with generics in general.
You seem pretty inconsistent here in general.
Yeah.
Some of ours are constrained to I-equatable of T. Some of ours are not.
What isn't? Because like index of that, we just we're basing our like index except any or whatever. We added the generic constraint.
The difference is in if we're saying that the type itself must support comparison, or if we allow custom comparers to be provided instead.
Maybe that's why I had two, and I left off the piece. Like maybe what I intended here was the first overload would be constrained to T, and the second one would not. But
I think that's what we do for sequencing call in the same class.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Because I don't think it's likely that I'm going to be writing a generic method that takes a T and then I forward that T on to common prefix length. I'm pretty sure that every call site that I end up writing in practice common prefix length will have a T baked in at the call site. It wouldn't just be some forwarded generic.
Makes
I mean,
sense.
I could be wrong, but
Or I equate
I equatable, not I comparable.
Yeah, I mean, like, if we are looking at this, I mean, like, most of the scenarios we are talking about is mainly for chars. I mean, I'm not seeing like a good scenario for other things, other chars. So why we don't just expose something specific for chars?
I think simply because we are not going to do anything that's custom for char. So as long as we're exposing it, it might as well be as useful. But I don't feel super strongly about it.
yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
I mean, the default for memory extensions is basically, unless you need custom handling, you do T, right? Seems more consistent on the type to expose it on to something that is specific.
Well, the thing about memory extensions is that normally if you're searching for something, you have that baked in at the call site. Like if I'm looking for a very specific character or a very specific string, and that's a literal in my application. If I'm doing common prefix length, chances are neither input is a literal, which means that now we need to be careful about like not breaking the prefix across surrogates, stuff like that. That would just never happen if I pass in a literal.
Is this missing the span overloads since extension methods aren't visible through implicit conversions?
Oh, right.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Otherwise, I think we're all.
Maybe we should. We're on a path where we double everything because of that. Should figure out at some other date how to address that.
Yeah.
Delete read-only span and make it const span of T. Love it. Ship it.
But we would only have to change the first argument, right? The second.
Yeah.
Right. We just care about, can the user have a span and access this function?
Yep.
We just forward internally to the read-only span one.
Yeah, it's a good catch.
I hate typing in this text box. Absolutely doesn't do what I wanted to do.
But I do agree with Tarek's point that if it might be beneficial at some point in the future to add string enlightened overloads of this, or at least things that understand how UTF whatever works. But at the moment, the call sites that we have that would benefit from this don't care. They literally just want element by element.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the main scenarios. I mean, like we are always talking about char here, and the scenarios like, you know, getting the prefix for the 5 passes. I mean, probably. I mean, like if running on Windows, you will need like casing and some other stuff. And so we are talking about this just like chars. But I'm fine with the proposal. I mean, I'm not objecting that. But what I'm trying to say is really, I mean, like, if we are talking about the scenarios, so we should focus more about chars scenarios more than generics. I mean.
Yeah, and I think you're largely right. The funny thing is the call sites that were identified as scenarios in the issue here want incorrect behavior. At least what we would consider incorrect behavior as far as Unicode processing goes. Which means that they would be better served by just some generic T that doesn't understand anything whatsoever about Unicode.
So are we still convinced that we can do this later, or is this something we want to design into this?
I think we're saying we can add char later.
Yeah.
That's what I heard earlier, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, we can do char, we can do UTF-16 and UTF-8 later, and the UTF-8 at the very least is going to be a bit weird, but it can be done.
Generally, like a true statement.
Well, just because you're going to have to return multiple values, not a single value. Because you're going to have to return, like, by the way, you've eaten like 5 bytes in input A, but 7 bytes in input B. The common prefix, they share a common prefix, but it's different length.
This is awesome.
Yep.
That's what I mean.
If
Variable
we're
length
willing,
encodings, go for it.
if we're willing, I've got one API from our friends at Intel that I think the people here would just say approved. It's the Xarc serialize one there. Like 5 down. Yep. Basically, this is an API that exposes a full serializing fence across all cores. So it does the same functionality as CPU ID, but without trashing registers and completing it faster. It's a new API, and our friends at Intel would like to expose this with .NET 7 to help support their new hardware and allow users to get off of using CPU ID to fully serialize across all cores.
And what's functionally, how does this differ from interlock.memory barrier process wide?
This would be a more efficient way to do it. And theoretically, we could update process. I think we could update process wide to use this under the covers on updated hardware.
I guess that makes sense. I guess I'm wondering the inverse is if they're functionally the same thing, just like how we expose things on bit operations, would it make sense for that to just be the implementation? Sorry, go ahead.
With the bit operations, we've exposed the underlying APIs as well for users who need the individual light up, and because we functionally have to have in the JIT a way to represent that instruction as a node, and so functionally speaking, we're going to have this type, and we'd end up having it defined, exposed, is supported, etc. So it can play into cross-gen, ready to run, etc. It's just a question of, do we say it's internal only, or do we actually just expose it publicly for consistency? Because it's going to exist and it's always going to exist. And basically, all the languages that support intrinsics are exposing and supporting the new instructions as they come out. So it's a consistency reason to expose it publicly.
And this seems to match other stuff that we expose here.
Yep.
Do we need the x64 sub or nested type?
Yes, because that plays into how the inheritance works across various classes and make sure the supported checks correctly report true versus false.
Okay.
Otherwise, you'd end up doing x86 serialize .x64, and you'd get the x64 class that's exposed on x86 base, and it would say true, and then it confuses users.
So you definitely need the method hiding here, if nothing else.
Yep.
Be very clever, and that is an example where clever is. But I mean, I still like the readability that it gets you, and I still like the general feature where you don't have to do ridiculously redundant checks or coding in here. Overall, it'll be worth it.
Yep, and then of course the class name is x86 serialize here, because class name and method name can't be the same. And there was concern, I raised the concern that serialize itself is potentially a common name, so we wouldn't want it as a class name.
Presumably, we would not add a lot of members to this one, right? It's very specific to just this one.
Right. It's we map the class names to the instruction set names exposed by the hardware, and once those ship, they don't change. So x86 serialize is going to forevermore be only the serialize method.
Yeah, looks like we did the same thing with leading zero count and pop count as well.
Yep. We kind of have to map them one-to-one so that the is supported checks works as expected, so that cross-gen lights up, because cross-gen, tracks these is supported checks and says this method uses APIs from here.
Oh yeah, I see you did the whole like nested x64 class for pickle muckle duck as well.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. This is why Tenor always comes with 500 API.
Cool.
Right. Yeah.
Just noting for API review tomorrow, I can only attend half of it. I have another meeting I have to run to at 11. And I don't know if Steven's going to show up or not because C# LDM.
Yeah.
But
So is Jeremy still on the call? Probably, right?
No, it's just
Jeremy's
the three of us.
Yeah, Jeremy's on holiday, so he's likely not to be there tomorrow anyways.
So then what I'm hearing is I should move it to Thursday then?
That would work better for me for sure.
Yep.
So Thursday, 10 o'clock. We should also see if we should also schedule with Eric T and see if maybe there's a time that works for him, considering how far ahead of us he is.
With whom?
Eric T. There was a Jason. Sorry, was it Jason? There was a bigger issue that we skipped
that was
today.
the Jason one. I think it was the polymorphism
Yeah.
one, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we should set up one for we still have a lot of stuff that we can go through anyway, so I guess
Sure.
I mean I will ask him what the plan. Do you guys have anything for Thursday that you definitely need to go through, or should I schedule the Jason one? Would he be probably upset if he would? I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that is marked for 7.0.
Yeah. I guess it's just a question of do we want to try and push
Sorry,
get
there's
some more of the tiny backlog items done.
Yeah, I mean, in general, like I would say that the bigger the item is, the more chances are we need more iterations on that. So I would probably start with them sooner rather than later. But
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on where the other features are. Right? If some of them are just blocking progress entirely, and the JSON one is kind of like still very early, then it might be worthwhile going over.
Because like
it's not marked blocking yet.
Just looking at this list, the read-only span ref-t constructor one is going to impact the language at some point in the near future because Jared's working on ref fields. Fred asked for compare exchange, but I don't think that one's actually blocking. I've got one at the very bottom that's generic math related for int 128 and uint 128, and that one's likely going to be like the xarg serialize where it's basically saying, let's expose this type. We're going to mirror int 64. Does anyone have any objections?
I'll talk to Eric how soon he's ready. Maybe he doesn't want to be ready anyway on Thursday. And then, I mean, realistically, we now have 2 a week. So we talk about 4 days earlier rather than later.
Yeah, spending Thursday doing burn down, I think, is totally appropriate.
And let's do that. Then I see you guys on Thursday.
Awesome.
I say without having checked my schedule first.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Yes.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.